Arthur Griffith was for a very long time a neglected figure, but that's no longer the case. For many years, the main biography was one written by Sean O'Luing, this big solid book here, but it was written in Irish, so it had only a short or a small audience or readership. Then came a shorter one by Cowton Younger. After that, a longer volume by Brian May. Then Owen McGee's massive volume. And most recently of all, a new book, biography by Colm Kenny. Even I have written about him. So he is no longer the forgotten man that he had been for so long. And in today's talk, I'll discuss first the man and his ideas and his journalism. And then I'll talk about his quite improbable political career. Despite a rather distant, if not a very distant, Cavan-Monaghan connection, Griffith was a Dubliner and always saw himself as a Dub. He came from a poor background. His father was a printer, and he was apprenticed as a printer himself. And he was above all, throughout his life, a journalist. He lived in a world of ink and print. And like many printers in many countries in the world, he was a radical. He was a blunt, honest, unworldly man, always lived poor, though he could have acquired a substantial income had he moved to a commercial newspaper. Colm Kenny, his most recent biographer, describes him as small, limping, lower middle class politician with poor eyesight, an unglamorous wife, I don't know what that relevance is, an aversion to glamorizing violence and a tendency to sharp comments. Yet his leadership inspired a generation. Griffith was an autodidact, widely read, who wrote in strong and vigorous prose. Early in his career, to the embarrassment of many of his supporters and admirers, he was mildly anti-Semitic, but he grew out of it, and many people in Ireland and elsewhere had similar or stronger views. When he spent 2 years in South Africa, he sympathized with the Boers in their conflict with the British, not with the blacks against the Boers. He was, to a mild extent, a racist, but then very many people were before the First World War and even before the Second World War. He ran and he largely wrote 2 newspapers, the United Irishman and Sinn Féin, in which week after week, year after year, he tried to educate Irish nationalists and others in the demands and opportunities of nationalism. His paper was subsidized by the IRB, and it had a wide readership and a considerable influence. As one little example of Griffith's brilliance as a journalist, during the First World War, in the opening months of the war, his newspaper was banned, and he launched a new one called Scissors and Paste. This consisted entirely of articles from other newspapers that had already been passed by the censor. And yet he juxtaposed articles to such an extent that the British authorities were embarrassed, and this newspaper, consisting entirely of pre-approved articles, was banned as being subversive. He differed from most other Irish nationalists in that he thought and wrote not just about the Irish nation, but about the Irish state. Others fantasized about round towers, shamrocks, Irish wolfhounds, and so on. He thought of a government and a parliament that would support Irish industry, that would establish trade links with other countries, that would have a consular service to protect these links. He looked beyond Britain to other small countries, independent countries such as Norway or Bulgaria, that had achieved independence and provided Ireland with a more relevant example or model than a great power, a rich industrial country like Britain. And above all, He didn't simply want to get rid of British rule. He wanted to replace it with a new Irish system. In many ways, Griffith was broad-minded. He supported workers' rights and trade unions, although he hated Jim Larkin and was often vicious in his attacks on Larkin, whom he saw as representing British and not Irish trade unions. He supported women's suffrage at a time when the Home Rule Party was opposed to it. He supported proportional representation rather than the British first past the post system. Ironically, to move ahead for a minute or two, the British gave Ireland PR in a move to block Home Rule in 1920, while keeping their own primitive, unrepresentative system that they still have today, a system where X, the voter's X, marks the spot, a system appropriate for illiterates or innumerates. They gave Ireland a much better system, which we have fortunately retained. And despite the reason why this new system, PR, was imposed, to block or to weaken Sinn Féin, Griffith welcomed it as a superior and more democratic system of voting. He believed it should be retained. But back to Griffith's views before the Rising. He accepted that Britain, then of course the greatest power in the world, the leading power, ruling India, most of Africa, other parts of Asia, closely linked to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, that Britain, such a powerful country, would not grant Ireland full independence, would not concede an Irish republic. And there things turned out he was perfectly right. But he wanted as much independence as he thought the British would be likely to concede. And as a second best to a fully separate Irish republic, on the model of France or the United States, he argued, strangely by our standards now, in favor of a double monarchy on the Austro-Hungarian pattern, a pattern whereby one man, Franz Josef, was both Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, but there were separate parliaments in Vienna and in Budapest. And what he wanted was a system whereby one man, either Edward VII or later on George V, would be King of Britain and King of Ireland. But both parties would have separate parliaments and governments and would be linked only in the person of the Crown. He believed, wrongly and quite foolishly, I think, that this would satisfy the British, the Ulster Unionists, and even Irish Republicans. In the event, it satisfied none of them. He didn't want to form a party. He didn't want to become a politician. His aim was to convert the Home Rule Party and his 85 or so MPs in Westminster to his idea of abstaining from Westminster, withdrawing from London, establishing themselves as an independent parliament in Dublin on the model of Hungarian MPs who in 1867 withdrew from Vienna and established their own parliament in Budapest, which was later recognized by the Austrians. So Irish MPs should meet, form a parliament, legislate, have a government responsible to that parliament, and try to administer Ireland insofar as possible as if Britain didn't exist. The idea that the British would accept this, I think, is quite absurd. Of course they didn't. But he wanted his Sinn Féin movement, I'll come to the name in a minute, his Sinn Féin movement to be a pressure group, a lobby that would influence people, that would put forward ideas that others would take up and implement, not a political party. But it became a party, his movement, his Sinn Féin group, became a party partly, largely by accident. A Home Rule MP, Charles Dolan from Leitrim, was converted by Griffith's views, resigned his seat and ran for re-election as a Sinn Féin candidate. Griffith, caught off guard, had to suddenly form a political movement, a party, to support Dolan in his campaign in Leitrim. Dolan lost and vanished from the Irish scene. He went to live in the States, but the party that was founded as a support group, a support mechanism for him, continued as a political entity. To put it mildly, it was not a success. Griffith was careful not to contest either of the two general elections that were held in 1910. He knew that with Home Rule now on the agenda, with the probability, it seemed, that Home Rule would be implemented within a few years, that John Redmond would have patronage to dispose of, that there would be jobs for the boys in Dublin. Who cared about a minor group who said that all this should be ignored? It hadn't got a chance. Griffith accepted that, and his party slowly faded away. But his newspaper, entitled Sinn Féin, We Ourselves, that newspaper appeared regularly every week, and it kept his name and his ideas in the public eye. While, on the other hand, radical Republicans in the IRB operated in secret. As a secret society, they had to keep themselves, insofar as possible, below the radar, out of sight of Dublin Castle. The result that very few people in Ireland knew about the IRB and about its members who were planning a rebellion. Many people in Ireland knew about Griffith and Sinn Féin. In fact, the Home Rulers loathed Griffith, probably more than any other radical nationalist, because as a brilliant journalist, as a man with a sharp temper and a sharp tongue, he vilified them week after week, month after month, year after year. And the result was that when, in 1913, the Irish Volunteers were formed as a counterpart to the Ulster Volunteers, I'll come back to the Ulster Volunteers in a minute, they, the Irish Volunteers, were given the wrong name or sobriquet of Sinn Féin Volunteers, because Sinn Féin was associated with radical nationalists. These were radical nationalists, therefore they must be Sinn Féiners. Most of them weren't, and very many of them disliked the name that they were given, but it stuck. And then later, when some of those Irish volunteers staged the Easter Rising in 1916, by extension, the Sinn Féin Volunteers title was given to the Sinn Féin Rising. Again, it wasn't a Sinn Féin Rising, but the name was widely attached to it. Once more, often to the distaste, even the disgust of very many of the rebels who didn't see themselves as Sinn Féiners and rejected Griffith's idea of a monarchy. They, the rebels, wanted a republic, which he regarded as quite impossible of achievement. Griffith, like Patrick Pearse, had been impressed by the Ulster Volunteers. Their aim, of course, was to block Home Rule, to prevent any degree of devolved authority to Ireland, and in that way, they were Griffith's enemies. But they were putting into effect some of his ideas. Above all, the defiance of Britain. They were prepared to set up their own government in Belfast. This he saw as a model that Irish nationalists could and should follow. He was enthralled by their methods, so enthralled that he ignored their motives, their objectives. And in this, Griffith was in no way unusual. Almost all Irish nationalists, the Easter rebels, Pearse, Connolly and the others, they all quite failed to understand that the Ulster Volunteers, the Ulster Unionists had developed a similar rival nationalism to their own. Griffith, like all the others, was appalled by the prospect of partition. He was a geographical determinist. He thought in terms of the island of Ireland being a unit, rather than of the people of Ireland, which consisted of two rival groups, one of which, the million or so Ulster Unionists, wanted little or nothing to do with the rest. This was an awkward, an inconvenient fact, an inconvenient truth that he and all the others ignored for as long as they could. As we know, some people, a few, still ignore it today. As I mentioned, he believed there was no chance of a successful rebellion against the British. But he believed also that since Carson and the Ulster Volunteers had forced concessions from the British government by forming a private army, Irish nationalists should do the same. He joined the Irish Volunteers. He participated in the Howth gun running of 1914. And it is said that at a meeting held shortly after the outbreak of war. Griffith was one of those who decided that there should be a rebellion while Britain was preoccupied with a war against Germany. Nonetheless, in the background to the rising, in Holy Week 1916, Griffith was one of those who helped Owen MacNeill, the president, the commander-in-chief of the volunteers, in his efforts to stop the rising. He went to Bray, for example, with MacNeill's countermanding order. When the rising took place, it is said that he offered his services to the GPO garrison, but they turned him down, with very good reason. He wouldn't have been much use to them. He had appalling eyesight. He wouldn't have been valuable with a gun in his hand. And they took the view, quite rightly, that as a brilliant propagandist, he might be useful after the rising. Nonetheless, though he had no role in the rising at all, he was arrested in its aftermath, along with very many others who, like him, had no connection with it. One of those who arrested him, when asked to explain why Griffith had been rounded up with the others, said, "He's been inciting them." And that was a very true, fair, accurate comment. Over many years, Griffith had been inciting people who went further than he was prepared to go, who took guns in their hands and shot British soldiers, which he wasn't prepared to do, at least until the rising took place, and he never actually carried out the intention that he seems to have had of joining the rebels. But he had incited a whole generation of radical Irish nationalists, and he was, I suppose, a legitimate target for the British to arrest. He was imprisoned in Reading jail, an experience which he quite enjoyed. Enjoyed the absence of stress. He led a very, very stressful life as a journalist with a weekly deadline for his paper, most of which he wrote himself. And now he could relax, although it is said that quite typically he organized an informal newspaper in Reading jail, which he wrote out in longhand and circulated to his fellow prisoners. He was released at the end of the year, along with very many others, and then in 1917 came the annus mirabilis of the Sinn Féin party. His Sinn Féin, or rather a Sinn Féin, became vastly popular. It won a series of by-elections against the Home Rule Party in Roscommon, in Longford, in Clare and Kilkenny. Branches and clubs were formed throughout the country. By the end of the year, there was about 1,600 branches, as many as there were of the Home Rule Party. The Home Rule Party in that year effectively imploded. It collapsed. It had been undermined by the Rising. It had been undermined by a failed series of negotiations over the Home Rule question in the summer of 1916. John Redmond, its leader, was demoralized. And the wind seemed now in the sails of those who wanted not just Home Rule, but a fully independent Irish Republic. So the new Sinn Féin party, the mass Sinn Féin party, vastly different in scale from that Griffith had led before 1916, became the dominant force in Irish public life. But the dominant element within this new party was the Irish volunteers, including many of those who had fought in the Rising. And at the end of the year, De Valera succeeded Griffith as president of the party, though with Griffith as his deputy, vice president. And crucially, the dual monarchy, the Austro-Hungarian model that Griffith had put forward for so many years, was now abandoned in favour of Sinn Féin's commitment to an Irish Republic. One might note in passing that the abandonment of Sinn Féin, of its old policy, preceded by only a year the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy itself. In early 1918, Griffith was chosen as the Sinn Féin candidate for a by-election in East Cavan. And this was an important seat for Sinn Féin to win. It had lost 2 seats in recent months, in Ulster, in Armagh and Tyrone, and it wanted to break what it saw as the Ulster jinx. It wanted to break the impression that some people held that it was a 3 southern provinces party with no appeal in Ulster. And the campaign in East Cavan coincided with the conscription crisis. Until then, until March 1918, Ireland had been exempt from conscription in the First World War. Englishmen, Scotsmen, and Welshmen were sent in their hundreds of thousands to their deaths to fight, so many of them being killed. Irishmen were let off because they didn't want to go, because Redmond said it would cause embarrassment for him. And this, of course, became increasingly unpopular in Britain. Why should the British fight and die when the Irish, especially after they had shown themselves rebellious and treacherous in the Easter Rising, why should they be exempt? So when the Germans launched a massive offensive in March 1918 and seemed likely for a while to capture Paris and knock the French out of the war before the Americans could move in large numbers, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, decided to impose conscription on Ireland. And this provoked massive resistance. Irishmen were prepared now to fight and die in Ireland to avoid being sent to fight and die in France. Sinn Féin and the volunteers were able to take the lead in this campaign. It soon became clear to the government, British government, that there was no chance of them being able to impose conscription. But as a retaliatory measure, just to show that they were still in charge, they arrested very many, almost all of the leaders of the Sinn Féin party, including De Valera, the president, and Griffith, the vice president and candidate for East Cavan. They didn't arrest any of the Home Rulers. They didn't arrest Griffith's rival, the Home Rule candidate in Cavan, enabling the Sinn Féiners to regard Griffith as a martyr, to point out that he had been locked up yet again in jail because of his efforts to save young Irishmen from being sent to fight in the battlefields in France. So the fact that the Home Rule candidate remained free was regarded almost as a taint, as a disqualification of him. It was a great gift to Sinn Féin propagandists. And one Sinn Féin slogan in the Cavan election was "Put him in to get him out. Elect Griffith so that he'll be let out of jail," which of course was nonsense. There was no reason why he would be let out of jail, and he wasn't. But it was good propaganda. The result, Griffith was elected by 3,800 votes to 2,600 for his opponent. His opponent's position was further weakened by the fact that shortly before, all the Home Rule MPs in Westminster had withdrawn and gone back to Dublin, thereby implementing the abstention policy that Griffith had put forward and argued in favour of for very many years. So Griffith was now MP for East Cavan, but like all the others, he remained in jail. Until after the war, De Valera escaped from jail. Griffith was released in March 1919, and then he became vice president of the Dáil, with De Valera as the president. And when De Valera left Ireland for 18 months to go to the United States, Griffith became acting president of the Dáil, of the underground government. But he, as president, presided, and no more than that. He wasn't a dynamic leader. And it was typical of the man, typical of Griffith, the journalist, that he continued writing all the time, more interested perhaps in journalism than in running a government. And during this time, 1920, early 1921, the British Commander-in-Chief in Ireland, Neville Macready, noted week by week how the underground government, under Griffith's nominal presidency, was implementing some of the policies that Griffith had outlined in his journals, in his book, The Resurrection of Hungary, over many years. Take over local government, establish local courts, make British rule in Ireland make it be irrelevant to the Irish people. In the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, Griffith was arrested again and released only after the truce in July 1921. Soon after the truce, and soon after Griffith accompanied Lloyd George to London, excuse me, forget that, shortly after, Griffith accompanied De Valera to London to meet Lloyd George, although it was only De Valera who met the Prime Minister. All the others, Griffith and the rest of the team, just stayed and waited to be told what had happened. De Valera then decided that he would not lead the Irish delegation in the full formal negotiations with the British. This was one of the most controversial and one of the most widely debated decisions in modern Irish history. It is quite likely that one reason was De Valera had met Lloyd George, the only one of the Irish, of the Sinn Féin leaders to have done so, and realised just what a formidable opponent he would be across the negotiating table. When De Valera, before going to London to meet Lloyd George, sought advice from various different elements in Irish society, including Irish Unionists, the leader of the Southern Unionists, the Earl of Middleton, who knew Lloyd George well, said to De Valera, "Mr. De Valera, you are going to negotiate with Mr. Lloyd George. You must be a very brave man." And as Griffith discovered, to his cost, Lloyd George was a very skillful, devious, and successful negotiator. The Irish delegation was given quite inadequate instructions before going to London. For example, it wasn't told what its policy on Ulster was to be, an extraordinary gap, an amazing omission, which left Griffith as the leader of the delegation playing for time, trying to avoid any discussion of this when Lloyd George or Winston Churchill would bring it up, waiting, hoping day after day that he would get his instructions, which eventually he did. The Irish side from the top down was not well managed. Griffith and Collins were the two negotiators who met the British team regularly, often day after day, sometimes several times a day. And this has been controversial. Why was the whole delegation not involved? But there was nothing unusual in this. For example, just a few years earlier, in the Paris Peace Conference that ended the First World War, it was only the leaders, the Prime Minister, the presidents, who negotiated, not their foreign ministers, not others in their team. And some members of the Irish delegation were unimpressive. Lloyd George remarked about one of them, Robert Barton, "He's a pipsqueak. I wouldn't have appointed him an assistant secretary to an undersecretary." So it was those two, Griffith and Collins, who carried out the serious negotiations with a formidable British team, led of course by Lloyd George, but with Churchill, Lord Birkenhead, Austen Chamberlain and others involved as well. The Irish wanted, if negotiations were to break down, that the break should come on Ulster, on partition. It would be an emotive issue back in Ireland. The British were determined that wouldn't happen. As Lloyd George put it in the cabinet meeting, in Ulster, we have a very weak case because of the nationalists, the Catholic majorities in Tyrone, Fermanagh, South Armagh and Derry City. So the Irish wanted a break on Ulster, but their main concern, privately among themselves, was as much sovereignty, as much independence as possible for Ireland. They knew they couldn't get a republic. Lloyd George had made that absolutely clear. It was never a demand of the Irish. De Valera never told them to look for a republic. He knew it wasn't on. But they wanted to whittle down the role of the crown as much as possible to ensure that there would be no oath of allegiance to the king. And this was something that the section of the cabinet back in Dublin was determined on maintaining. No oath of allegiance to the king. The negotiations in London lasted for nearly 2 months. And at a crucial stage, Griffith agreed that if a boundary commission were to be set up to adjust the border between the two parts of Ireland, then he wouldn't embarrass Lloyd George. He wouldn't get in his way. And he approved in a casual and careless fashion a little memorandum that was drafted confirming this agreement. Once that had been done, Lloyd George knew that he could split the Irish delegation on the question of a boundary commission. There wouldn't be a break on Ulster. The negotiations continued until eventually, having secured concessions in various other areas, the Irish agreed to sign. They agreed on a boundary commission, of course, They agreed that there would be an oath to the king, but not an oath of allegiance. And this is an important point. For the last century, many Irish people have believed there was an oath of allegiance to the king in the treaty. Some people, I'm sure, still do. There wasn't. There was an oath of fidelity. The Irish members of Parliament, the TDs, would swear to be faithful to His Majesty King George V and so on. And obviously, since allegiance had been dropped and replaced by fidelity, there was a difference between the two. So the delegates signed the treaty, returned to Dublin, to be met by a furious, indignant De Valera, who accused them of going back on their word, their promises, of abandoning the Irish case, and so on. And the cabinet split 4-3 in favour of the treaty. There were long debates in the Dáil, spread over the Christmas and New Year, in which Griffith and Collins were, of course, the two main speakers on behalf of the treaty. And then, on the 6th of January, 22, the Dáil voted on the treaty by approving it by 64 votes to 57, a very small majority. De Valera ran for re-election as president, was defeated, and was replaced by Griffith. But the post that Griffith occupied, he was president of the Dáil, by extension, president of the Republic, that wasn't the position that held real power. It was Collins, as chairman of the provisional government, who began amassing all the powers and responsibilities that the British had exercised in Dublin until 1922. The main opposition to the treaty at the time was not partition, not the Boundary Commission. Nobody on the Irish side paid much attention to it. It was regarded as something that will sort itself out in the fullness of time, an attitude that was either foolish, careless, or naive. All the attention in the treaty debates and afterwards was devoted to the oath to be taken to the king. And this was what caused the treaty split, and this was the main issue, one of two main issues involved in causing the Civil War. The other main issue was the loyalty or disloyalty that the army would show towards the government. It became clear that a majority of the IRA opposed the treaty, and very many of its members would fight a government that tried to implement it. In the following months, in early 1922, Griffith took a hard line against those elements in the IRA that defied the government. He insisted that there should be a general election, that Ireland was a democracy, that the people should decide the issue. He opposed the Collins-De Valera Pact that seemed to make excessive concessions to the Republican minority. And when elections were held in June 1922, 78% of the electors voted for pro-treaty candidates. Griffith topped the poll in Cavan, which was now a united constituency, both former parts, East and West, now in one new constituency. And the vote for him was 3 times that of all the other candidates put together. And one remarkable feature of the Cavan election in 1922 was that all 3 Sinn Féin candidates were pro-treaty. There was one farmer, Baxter, and in the first preference votes, Baxter won 5,000 votes. The weakest of the 3 Sinn Féin candidates, Sean Milroy, only 500. And yet, so massive were Griffith's transfers, and then transfers from the other Sinn Féin pro-treaty candidate, Walter Cole, that Milroy was elected, and Baxter, despite his impressive performance in the first round, picked up so few transfers that he was defeated. But then, within 2 weeks of the election that resulted in such a clear victory for the treaty, civil war broke out. Griffith became acutely depressed. His health broke down, and on the 12th of August, he died of a heart attack. Some people have said, I myself for a while even said, that he died of a stroke. That was a common opinion. But medical authorities say that no, his death was so sudden It couldn't have been a stroke, it must have been a heart attack. But he had been living a very stressful life. He was a heavy smoker. He took little exercise. He'd been accustomed to walking and swimming, but not in the last year or so. The treaty negotiations and the disputes that followed the treaty ruled that out. So it is almost certainly a heart attack that killed him at the age of 51. But by then, age 51, he was seen as the grand old man of Irish nationalism. A man who, as I mentioned at the beginning, was honest, dogged, and blunt, a man of ideas, a brilliant propagandist, not a successful politician. Let me conclude with a quotation from an article written many years ago by Terence de Vere White in a book, The Shaping of Modern Ireland, edited by Conor Cruise O'Brien and published as long ago as 1960. De Vere White wrote, "I think of Arthur Griffith as of a man who has toiled for 10 years to write a play, dedicating all his time, sacrificing everything for this play, and when it is written, finding that no one will put his play on. And then, after 10 years, the play is the thing. It makes a popular success, but in a guise that makes little resemblance to the play as it was written." What I describe has no doubt happened to many dramatists, but Griffith's experience is unique because he was eventually to take a leading part in the distorted version of his own play. His performance was thought by some to be the best thing in his life, by others an anticlimax. If a name is to be given to Griffith's play, it is Sinn Féin. And then fast forward to the end of this chapter. Griffith believed, I am sure, that his original faith in his play was justified, even though the theatre had gone up in flames and was blazing around him when he died. So, like very many Irish nationalists, Daniel O'Connell comes to mind, Parnell also, Griffith saw himself as a failure at the end of his life. But even though he did fail to achieve a peaceful Ireland, even though he failed to achieve a united Ireland, he accepted that as an inevitability long before the treaty was signed, nonetheless, he must be regarded as one of the more successful Irish politicians. After all, he did get in the treaty what he had wanted and what he had argued in favour of for very many years, a dual monarchy. George V was king of Britain and Ireland, but there were separate independent parliaments in Britain and Ireland. And as Collins said in the course of the treaty debates, the treaty doesn't give us the full freedom that all nations aspire and develop to, but the freedom to achieve that freedom. And Griffith was one of the principal characters in the Irish Revolution who brought about that new independent Irish state, which did ultimately, within 20 years or so, achieve full freedom for most of the island. Not a bad record.